Welcome everyone to the Profane Egyptologist podcast. Now this week's guest is an emergent voice in historical fiction. She's the author of two books, Cleopatra Shadows and The Drowning King, but her career was not always geared in that direction. With an interest in the systems and motivations behind people's influences, perceptions and behaviours, our guest took a major in sociology before becoming an editor at a high-profile political news site, Salon.com. In her prose, she shines a light on the ancient world which is both captivating and unflinching, painting a picture of Ptolemaic Egypt which could make even Game of Thrones look tame. Indeed, her historical fiction has even been called the Game of Thrones of ancient Egypt. As a fan of her work, I've been looking forward to this interview for a very long time. So without further ado, ladies and gents, I give you Emily Holleman. Emily, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Paul. I'm excited to chat about Cleopatra Shadows and The Drowning King.
As am I. And I want to get to those, and I've got a lot of questions about those. But before we do, I'd like to kind of take it back in time, if you will, to some of your influences growing up. And you've mentioned that you were raised on a steady diet of Greek and Egyptian myth. In a fairly agnostic household. Could you kind of expand on that and how that led to this?
Absolutely. So my mom is Jewish and was raised somewhat religiously, and my father was raised Protestant, but certainly would not describe himself thusly. Neither of them really believed in anything, and we read some Bible stories as educational background, but mostly we read a lot of D'Aulaire's Greek myths when I was very young. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the D'Aulaire's book. It has this sort of chariot on the front. Our copy actually didn't even have the jacket, so I always think of this as this very large gray hardcover book. And it has not all of the Greek myths, but it has a wide variety of Greek myths. And my sister Julia and I, those were our favorite bedtime stories when we were growing up. And I think I just always found the gods to be so fascinating. And I loved sort of all of the, sometimes petty fights between them. I loved reading about them. I was always fascinated by them. And I did also sort of imbue them with a little bit of sort of magic and mysticism, because as a kid, there is this desire to pray to something sometimes, right? Sometimes you can't control things, which continues to be true in life. And as a child, I definitely would occasionally pray to Aphrodite or Athena, or just whoever felt like maybe they'd have an edge, if I had a crush on somebody, pretty obvious. If it were, something to do with schoolwork, Athena was kind of a favorite. So that was certainly something that really influenced me growing up. And I was very much into all of those stories. And part of the appeal when I was writing about this was to write about someone, Arsinoe, who would have been very steeped in those stories, even more so than I was as a child. And then as for the Egyptian stuff, I was one of those kids who had the hieroglyphic stamp set and all of those things. And
I had one of those too.
Yeah, because they were amazing. And I wanted to write my name in hieroglyphics, even though I'm still not 100% sure how we got to that and how that worked in terms of my my little cartouche and all that stuff. So I was one of those kids and I loved that. And I was very lucky to be able to travel. I traveled a lot with my parents when I was growing up, and being able to go when we went to Greece when I was about, I want to say maybe I was 12 or something like that. We called it our trip to the Holy Land. So, I mean, there was a lot of sort of joking about the pagan worship going on in the household as well. Not actual worship, and not to denigrate anybody who is involved in actual worship of these gods, but it was certainly something that was very influential for me and something that I loved and was fascinated by. And I also was just fascinated by these stories that have stuck with us and still have so much meaning and that we want to tell and retell over and over and over again. Right now I'm rereading the new translation of the Odyssey by, gosh, I'm completely forgetting the woman's name, but there's a brand new translation, first translation of the Odyssey by a woman. And I also just read Madeline Miller's Circe, and just like, what is it about these stories that is so compelling that helps us understand what it is to be human, that we're still returning to them, 2,500 years later.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite a common thread that people's fascination with the ancient world, and that's kind of, the area that I'm steeped in at the moment, is talking to people who've had this fascination. It tends to start in childhood. It tends to start with, reading and images and literature and stories of gods and myths. And these things speak to us on an almost Jungian level, I suppose, is one way of putting it. Were there any particulars that stood out for you as a child?
I really liked the story of Persephone. My sister and I were both very into Persephone. And I actually was recently watching this home video that was for my sister's very young. I mean, she was young, so I was even younger. So I barely remember this, of when she was 5 and I was 2 or something like that, or 3. And she was playing Persephone in this, child's, birthday party. There was some actress who was making money on the side by doing children's birthday parties, doing this, and then Persephone comes. And, one of our family friends was playing Hades. And at the time, nothing seemed weird to me about this. And there was nothing actually weird that happened. He wasn't doing anything wrong or creepy, except I was like, oh my God, this story is so creepy. And there's this 5-year-old girl who's now being kidnapped and married to this 40-year-old man. And it's so weird. It's so weird. But that was certainly a story that really, that sort of spoke to me. I think I always liked Apollo and Artemis because I liked that sibling closeness, and I felt very close with my sister. So those were some stories. And I'm trying to think I loved the Odyssey. I always loved all the stories of Odysseus. And I remember as I got older and kind of started reading some of the, some Euripides and some of the sort of other angles of Odysseus, who is kind of awful and kind of a jerk a lot of the time, despite being this sort of, you're like, oh, he's so smart, and he's not the brawny one, and he's the one who can figure everything out. But then you're like, but there's this other side of him as being this very cold, very political figure who's just ready to sell everybody out when he has to, and is basically fine with the fact that all of his men die. I mean, he's sad, but such is life.
Funnily enough, I remember the scene in the book where Arsinoe is actually studying that text with Ganymedes and her friends, and they get into an argument about the nature of the hero of the piece, and was he scared, was he brave, was he clever, was he cunning, and he came back alone. And it was that kind of depth, I think, depth of thought and analysis, even in little moments like that really drew me into the character in the book, because those are kind of potentially quite small scenes of someone studying, yet there were all these insights into the actual history as well as insights into building that character, which I found really fascinating. So it started with stories, and you eventually, did you study writing? Because you started working as a journalist after a while. Right.
I actually majored in university. I majored in sociology, which is people are either that's really weird, or I kind of see it. What my sort of explanation is that I've always been very interested in how people work and what makes people do the things that they do. That's definitely what drives me as a writer. And when I was studying sociology, a lot of that was about sort of systems and the way that religion, I did a lot of sociology of religion as well, more modern religions, not sociology of ancient religions, but Islam and Christianity, and just sort of the ways in which how we think about the world, and as well as the bigger social and governmental structures influence the way that we behave in different situations, which is, I think, something that certainly as a writer who's also very interested in world building and like creating this whole sort of ancient world that functions in its own right and is both like constructed very much based on the historical, but also based on like what you have to imbue it with a certain amount of life, right? There's not enough to just, you have the history, but something that's 2,000 years ago, you have to like really think about how these people would have thought. And a lot of the research that I was doing was thinking about how people actually think about the world in which they live. And for me, again, that's rooted in stories, right? It's rooted in the stories that we tell, the stories that we have to analyze, the stories that we think of one way when we're children, and then we look back on, and they're like, oh God, that story doesn't mean at all what I thought when I was 10. When I was 10, this story had this very clear message, and there was a very clear sense of good and evil, or there was a very clear sense of who was doing the right thing or what the right thing was, and then coming back to that same story later on in life and being like, wow, actually, this is so much more nuanced and so much more complicated, and my sort of way of viewing it then has very little to do with the way I view it now.
That must have been really useful set of skills when you moved to Salon, which is known as quite a political publication. So you were working as an editor there, correct?
Yes, mostly as an editor. I started pretty shortly after I graduated. I interned there as a news intern for a while, and then I worked as an editor there. I wrote some pieces, but mostly editing.
What attracted you to that kind of area after studying sociology?
Well, there's a lot of, sociology, I feel like the social sciences, there's a lot of overlap between sociology, political science, and anthropology, and they're really sort of mostly slightly, oh God, I'm sure some sociologists or anthropologists will like shoot me for saying this, but they're very similar. They're very similar areas of study that sort of take different angles to analyze very similar problems, right? So a lot of I also took a lot of writing courses when I was in college. As I'm sure you're familiar, American universities, you can like essentially take half your courses are basically whatever you want, and maybe even and half your courses are in your major. So there's a lot of leeway in terms of, finding oneself or messing around, depending on how you're feeling about it on a given day. Coming back to, so I've always been pretty interested in politics, and one of the things that drew me to sociology was also the marriage of like looking at how systems work and also how politics work and why people vote the way that they vote or view the world the way that they do, which is all very sort of tied up in that. So I was definitely interested in the political angle, and that was certainly when I started at Salon, was definitely actually while I worked there, I ended up working on editing a bunch of different types of things, including personal essays and like more culture type pieces, as well as some politics stuff. But politics was actually definitely my entry point there.
And that's a sensibility that's kind of, I can see it's a common thread in a way through your work, because even though you're dealing with historical fiction, the sense of the political in the ancient world is extremely deep in your work. Did you find any, when you were doing your research, and I'd like to get more into that actually, but did you find any similarities in the way that the ancient Greeks and Romans would share news and gossip?
Absolutely. First of all, the gossiping is just such a sort of universal human phenomenon. There's definitely so much gossip in the way. Some of the very few things that you can actually read that are actually written at the time about Cleopatra, and there's basically nothing written at the time about Arsinoe, is Cicero complaining bitterly about how he hates Cleopatra, mostly because she forgot to send him some book from the library in Alexandria that she said she was supposed to send her. That when she got back, this is later than anything in the book. This is when she's visiting Caesar in Rome after their son Caesarion is born. And so absolutely. And so much of what we get is from these letters, which are mostly preserved from the Romans. And so much of so much of all of it, I mean, one of the biggest challenges researching this book is that almost everything that we have is written by the Romans. We have nothing that is written, I mean, Romans or Greeks living under the rule of the Roman Empire, because, of course, after Actium, after Octavian defeats Cleopatra and Antony, there is essentially nothing but the Roman Empire left. So everybody who's writing after that is writing under the auspices of Rome, and usually these are either Greeks living in the eastern part of the empire or Romans living in the western part of the empire. So it's all through this lens, and this very particular lens of how did Rome see Egypt, which is all caught up, of course, in how did Rome see itself, which was caught up in how does Rome see itself versus Greece. And then you have the fact that the Ptolemies are descended from the Macedonians, but they're ruling Egypt, but they're trying to present this very Greek face, the Greek facing versus the Egyptian facing, right? So the Ptolemies are super fascinating because of this, because they're trying to be two different sets of people. There's the Mediterranean world, which is sort of like the national stage on some level, and then there's the domestic stage. And to the international world, they're like, we're Greeks, we're descended from the Greeks, we're all about Alexander, we're essentially the blood of Alexander, we're the last of the, great Hellenistic empires. And towards their own people, who, again, which is even a complicated thing to say, because in Alexandria, it was an incredibly cosmopolitan city in terms of having lots of people of various Greek origins, lots of people from Palestine, from all parts of the Near East, as well as lots of sort of native Egyptians. But then as you got farther up the Nile, you would have much more sort of traditionally like Egyptian people who'd been living there for thousands and thousands of years. And towards those people, it was the entire political, they were essentially trying to make themselves look as Egyptian as possible. I mean, even the temples that Cleopatra built in, as I'm sure you know, in other parts of Egypt, mimicked very closely, or as closely as they could, these sort of New Kingdom styles, the same iconography. Everything is a continuation, even though it had been hundreds and hundreds of years since the last of the, what we would consider the proper pharaohs in the New Kingdom had ruled. And even though they were not descendants of those people. And even this whole sibling marriage thing is such a sort of what a bizarre, how they wrapped their heads around it. Because the rest of the Greek world really despite the gods all marrying each other, because that's what gods do, the Greeks were really not that into, incest was not something that they were into for mortals, generally, as many cultures are not. And the Egyptians weren't particularly into it for anybody but their rulers, who were considered to be gods. But starting with the second generation of Ptolemies, Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II got married each other, and as far as we know, probably produced offspring. Some of the time they did, some of the time they didn't. And then they practiced all of the sibling marriage, again, in part as this effort to link themselves to the royal, / divine bloodline of the earlier pharaohs, who had also practiced a lot of this sibling marriage.
This does lead into some other areas, though. I mean, there are so many taboo subjects in the ancient world, and you already mentioned the marriages between brother and sister and incest. With these things, did you ever wonder, do I need to censor any of this out or downplay it, or did you think, this is too important to?
Well, did I think about censoring it out? Not really, which was maybe a naivete on my part when I was first working on the books, because I didn't really, I didn't worry very much about that. I don't think that we gain a lot by shying away from subjects that make us uncomfortable. I think that investigating what actually, humans are sort of endlessly complex creatures who do all sorts of things that seem completely inexplicable or really terrible, and really unpleasant. And certainly writing in my second book, The Drowning King, Ptolemy, who's the other main character, certainly in many ways does many things that are very much against what I politically think and what I think people should do. But I don't think that there's any benefit in ignoring that. And I think that investigating like the humanity behind things that make us uncomfortable is a general good. And that investigating it from a long time ago can be, I think that there's something freeing in it, in that if you're investigating truly terrible things that are happening right now, it's hard. When you try to see the humanity in something, it's hard to do that without looking like you're also whitewashing it, right? Without looking like you're also saying, oh, but this person's like, here's this person doing horrible things, but those horrible things are actually affecting people today. When you look at the ancient world and you sort of shine a mirror back then, what's done is done and is done 2,000 years ago. So there's no feeling that like, oh, by looking at the humanity behind what Ptolemy is doing, or how he is treating basically the slave girls that are serving him, and what sort of influences him there, and like the way that he's raised to believe that he is owed everything, and investigating what that looks like, I'm not justifying something that is currently happening, right? There's not that risk. So I think that because it's so long ago, it makes it easier to look into it with sort of a more, I don't know, more open heart, without the sort of fear of justifying something that is really terrible. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. And I can draw a very, very crude analogy by saying it's kind of like exploring the historical version of Joffrey from Game of Thrones. And we will come back to that. But before we do, I want to pick up on this point that, that there is quite an, I guess I could say, unromantic aspect to the way that the ancient world is explored in your work. There's no Hollywood gloss over it to make it all sanitized and acceptable. Was it your intention to go in that direction from the outset, or did the material naturally lead you there just because of the nature of it?
I think a little bit of both. Obviously I'm somebody who is like passionate about the ancient world, and I've watched lots of things and read lots of things. But I think what is sort of, for me, most compelling is remembering, both there is this incredible distance with the ancient world, but also they're people, and they were people, and there were still people who were trying to sort of dig into the way that they understood the world and the way that they understood each other, and were still driven by the same sort of ambition and greed and love and, the same things that drive us now. So I think looking at it in this sort of unvarnished way, it makes it feel, God, this makes it sound like I'm living in some sort of like horror world. I just mean, like, I don't think that making it all pretty is the way to actually make it feel close to what we actually experience. I think that sort of looking for what the human experience is and not sort of prettifying it, is what makes for sort of interesting work. And so that was certain. And then, yes, of course, you can't, this is a family where, they're killing their siblings all the time. They're killing their parents. They're killing there's not a lot of prettiness to the Ptolemies. They're not a pretty dynasty. But to be honest, most dynasties are not terribly pretty. And many of them involve lots of sibling murder and internecine conflict all the time, because when you have a very small number of people competing for basically all the power in the world, essentially, it's going to be violent and rough and tumble. That has been true throughout history, and most dynasties, and actually, ironically, one of the reasons that sibling marriage was seen as a good thing is that the idea was to sort of concentrate power more, so you'd have fewer people vying for the throne. Of course, it didn't actually work, because then you just had the siblings vying against each other for the throne, and not like the sort of nobles the way you would in, say, Tudor England or something like that. You just have a much smaller group of people. But it was sort of from this idea that, oh, well, if the siblings marry each other, then maybe they won't fight with each other so much about who gets to rule and whose husband has more power and whose son has more influence. Did not turn out great, but
no, it absolutely didn't. And Coming to sources, the idea of sources, and I've wanted to pick your brain about this for at least a couple of years now. So this is for the fellow historians and archaeologists out there. I know that you dug really, really deeply into ancient sources and what we might call, primary sources, Cicero, Caesar, Plutarch, Appian, etc. But one thing that struck me, and certainly something that comes through in the reading of your work, is that there are so many male voices in Greek and Roman history and relatively few female. And where in the ancient world women had comparatively few rights when compared to men, in Greece, for instance, and we see that the picture of historical figures such as Cleopatra, of powerful women like Cleopatra, being treated by Rome in less than auspicious terms. She's referred to as a whore, she's overtly sexualized, but there's no denying the clear intelligence and strategic nature of her being. Was there an interest in the outset of exploring those non-sexualized aspects to bring kind of a balance to this picture?
Absolutely. One of the things, so the sort of two things that really interested me when I first started writing about this was I was reading about Cleopatra, and I had this sort of general image that you have in your head of like this, sort of sex body, like she slept with Antony, she slept with Caesar, like, tragic death, etc. idea of her. But I didn't know anything about her family at all. And I found that really interesting. And as, the sort of younger sister angle of like, what would it be like to have Cleopatra as your younger sister? But the sort of opposite, the sort of flip side of that is, what would it be like to turn this sort of incredibly sexualized, like the first sort of like pinup girl almost, like this image that we have of Cleopatra, and look at her not at all from that perspective of Rome and of her lovers. And that has always been one of the things that sort of keeps inspiring me to continue working on these books is, yes, everything that we know about Cleopatra is basically everything that's even remotely close to the dates that she lived is through the Roman eye, right? I mean, Caesar writing about her is almost hilarious because he, keeps these war journals and barely writes about her at all and writes only in this like, and then we had this like political, like Cleopatra did X and Ptolemy did Y, and you're like, and you're sleeping together, but cool. Let's like just totally gloss that over. That's not a thing at all. So and he writes in the third person, which is also just like fascinating and weird and sort of endlessly like, I find reading sort of Caesar's war stuff very funny. And of course, then Alexandrian War is not really, probably it was written by one of his associates, not by Caesar, even though anyway, that's completely aside. But yes, this sort of idea of they saw her in this very sexualized way. They had to admit, Plutarch especially, like how intelligent she was, how charming she was, how she had this incredible facility with languages. But mostly what's interesting to them is her influence on these men, on these Roman men. And looking and thinking, what was it like in her dynasty, which was this sort of collapsing dynasty, which had been a collapsing dynasty amid all of these dynasties that had collapsed before Rome. And she was sort of holding on to the last gasp of the Hellenistic. I mean, the entire Hellenistic era is just rooted in the Ptolemies at this point. And what would it be like to look at her motivations and not just see her as this sort of, sexy woman who swayed the world because these two very powerful men wanted to sleep with her.
And I really like how you use those sources to get into those characters. Although, there are so scant sources for some of the characters that are really quite expanded on. How did you kind of make the jump from what we've got in the record, which is mostly X happened on Y day for this many days, and X attended this, and we have 300 barrels left of this? How did you go from some of those quite dry historical sources to building out these really, fully fleshed out characters that you have, particularly in the first book, where it's not even centered on Cleopatra?
Yeah, no, I mean, the first book to the second book is kind of fascinating because the first book, as I'm sure you know, there's almost nothing. Like it's basically bookended by two sort of known major historical events. You have, we know that after Cyprus fell to Cato and the Romans, and King Ptolemy's brother killed himself, we know there was a revolt in Alexandria. We know that Berenice and her mother probably her mother. We don't even know if it's actually her mother or probably her mother, Cleopatra Tryphena, who takes over. So we know that happens. We know that Ptolemy flees to Rome, first to Cyprus, then to Rome first to Rhodes, then to Rome to ask for help. We know that. Then everything that happens in Egypt, the only things that we know are when the Romans are present. Romans are basically not present until the end of the book. The other things that we know are basically from Strabo's geography, which is like, and Berenice married this guy, and she killed him 3 days later, and then she married this guy. That's it. So a lot of it is about how do you read. I mean, this is the wonderful thing about writing fiction and writing historical fiction is you have the leeway to think, okay, who is Strabo? Strabo is this Roman. He's visiting under Augustine's rule. He does go to Alexandria, but this is all after Cleopatra is dead for at least a decade. And what is his angle here? He's Roman. He probably doesn't think very much of women being in power. He writes about Berenice in a way that is not very flattering, and that's not terribly surprising. What do I think is likely to have happened from what I know of humans and how people work? Do I really think that she killed him in 3 days? Does that sound like something that's more of a rumor and more of an exaggeration, or more of something that actually happened exactly the way it was being told, right? And that's the great thing about fiction is you can answer all those questions because we only have Strabo to go on this 3-day madness with. And I can say, you know what? Strabo wasn't there because he sure as hell was not in Egypt when this happened. He was 10 and growing up. And he would have heard this very sort of third-hand information through a lot of gossip. And so much of the early historian stuff is through gossip. And I don't even mean that in a negative way. It's just the best historians, Thucydides, for instance, talked to so many people and really tried to get to the bottom and and this is all way before he didn't write about any of this. He's long dead, but really tried to get to the bottom of as much talking to people, getting really what we would consider primary accounts. But even those are still verbal accounts of what people remember. And much of this is what people thought based on what was known, which was a very sort of vague thing, especially if you're, Strabo probably talked to people in Egypt many years after something happened. And there's a preference for these very flashy, fun stories as well. Plutarch is definitely guilty of this. And Plutarch is so much fun because he loves a good story. And what it's about is there's not this sort of modern historical sense of, you have to check this and you have to check this and you have to check this. They're still inventing what it means to be history. And there's still an invention of what is the difference between history and myth and legend. And it's not that set in stone. People thought of the Iliad and the Odyssey as tales of things that happened, right? So where is the line between that and what other people are reading? But my other favorite thing about if you read these histories is people give these long speeches that are recorded hundreds of years after they gave the speech, which were definitely not the speeches that they gave, right? That's definitely not what anybody said. There's no way that this 3-paragraph, diatribe about whatever is actually what somebody said on the battlefield. We have no reason to believe that. But again, and this is not to discredit the historians of the time, there was a different standard of what it was considered more important to give this sense of what actually happened. Even if you're making up the exact words, the sense of what happened is that there was this great speech. So you write the great speech that you think that would have sparked it. And also that is influenced by whatever political things are going on in the background, right? Do we like Caesar or do we not like Caesar? Okay, where are we in the Julian Claudian dynasty in Rome? And there are all these other influences in terms of what actually gets written down. And that's still true today, Sometimes
I didn't want to say, but yes.
No, sometimes when I was reading this stuff, I would think okay, so if I were reading Breitbart writing about Hillary Clinton, and right now, which is not something I can often make myself do because it's just too upsetting. But how would I read that and how would I pick out what the truth is, right? And so that's often what I would apply when I was reading these Roman men. Like, what are their biases and how am I going to figure out what I think is a more likely, and also I'm not a historian, so I can be more likely and more compelling.
I mean, why should any of them be more concerned with the facts than the truth, I suppose, is what it comes down to, as they see it.
Especially today, post-fact world. So
Absolutely. I wanted to come back to the point, actually, that you mentioned about, and I don't want to give away too many spoilers for people who haven't read Cleopatra's Shadows yet, which I urge you all to go and do.
Thank you.
No, but seriously, I got really, really absorbed in this book, and I found, even though the voice changes from a focus on Arsinoe to start with to, I thought, subjectively at least, more focus on Berenice's story as it went along. And I got drawn more and more into her story and began to sympathize with her to a great extent towards the end of the book, which I guess was the point. The idea of the first husband, the 3-day husband, and the character of, and I don't know if I'm going to say this right, but I have ample reign to butcher pronunciations on this show, so I'm going to go with it. Meritmut.
Meritmut would be how I pronounce it, which also might be totally wrong, which is part of the problem of being largely autodidact when it comes to a lot of these things. I've read a lot more than I've actually heard people say, although I don't know if anyone really is that great at like Demotic Egyptian pronunciation today.
I know one or two people who are getting very good at it, but we're still very much struggling with the idea. So I find Meritmut really fascinating, not only as a kind of background anti-hero, but also what her role suggests of both power and gender. At this stage, I just want to jump in and explain that Meritmut is a character from Cleopatra's Shadows who first appears as a serving girl, but ends up becoming Queen Berenice's confidant and the person to whom the queen turns when dangerous and, spoilers ahead, sometimes deadly tasks are required. So Meritmut holds a form of power beyond that even of the queen, whilst also filling the role of the archetypal Egyptian wise woman, somebody well versed in Egypt's mysteries, and I use that term somewhat loosely. And I thought she was really interesting in the sense that, is it possible that she acts as a cipher for certain things that can transcend class?
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely that sense of being of where power really is and what and how you can exercise some amount of power. And there's also the question of what power is she really exercising and who is really in control in that relationship between Berenice and Meritmut. And definitely, and she is definitely the sort of, it's very hard. Writing about the Ptolemies is a lot of fun, but you also get to a point where you're like, oh wow, they've sort of ordinary people and like the actual native Egyptians and the people who are living in this country are very much eclipsed in these books most of the time. And Meritmut was definitely this character that I could have who represented a lot of the things that weren't going to be really delved super deeply into in this book, but are very, very real in terms of the relationship between the Ptolemies and the people that they ruled. And this fact that there's this whole civilization that has been sort of, you know, underneath this like Ptolemaic overlayer of this is what we're doing now. And we're sort of picking up these parts of your religion and these parts of your culture to like back up our power. But there's this whole other sort of world and other culture and other group of people who are not empowered.
I'm going to jump in here and add some context. The so-called liberation of Egypt from Persia's rule by Alexander the Great is historically interpreted as mostly well received in Egypt. This is of course the view of the victors, but it does appear that the native Egyptians famously resented the periods of rule under the Persians. The rule of the Ptolemies who followed Alexander is a point of controversy. They like to represent themselves as enlightened rulers who adopted Egyptian customs, but the truth is Alexandria and the Greek city, quote-unquote, of Ptolemais in southern Egypt were created for and filled with Ptolemaic, Macedonian and Greek elites. The native Egyptians were widely treated as second-class citizens in this period.
The Egyptians are more I mean, the Greeks are really terrible on gender stuff. And in a way, I think that the only reason that the Ptolemies have an unusual number of powerful queens for a Hellenistic dynasty, for really most dynasties. And I think part of that is the fact that Egypt, I mean, not that any place was like, people are like, would you like to live in ancient Egypt? And I was like, probably not, because like I would have no power and rights. So like for me, not great. But definitely more equal, more power for women, more comfortable with the idea of women having certain degrees of power, despite the fact that obviously, with the exception of Hatshepsut and it always ruled by men, but the idea of women in power and women having some amount of rights to divorce and some amount of rights to land and property, I think that there is a two-way street in terms of the influence, right? I mean, both with the Ptolemies and with later colonial dynasties, right? I mean, and there is definitely a sense writing about the Ptolemies about writing about a colonial power, like a more modern colonial power, because they are a sort of, they do come and they do have this very complicated relationship with the Egyptians. And it's not just a one-to-one like, oh, the Greeks think they're better than the Egyptians. Of course, on some level, they think they're better than the Egyptians. But they also have a huge inferiority complex about the fact that the Egyptians have a much older culture than Greece, which they definitely know is the case. And there's this idea of Egypt as like the birthplace of the gods and like as this place that has this like deep magic, which is both exoticized, but also like they're kind of jealous of it because like, oh, wow, that's like really something that we don't have. I mean, we, of course, because our Western democracy is built so much in this like image of Greece and also this ideally hagiography of Greece, we don't think of it this way, but the Greeks didn't like have civilization the way the Egyptians had civilization, like at this time, right? The Egyptians had like 2,000 years. The Greeks had like 700. I mean, they were not building, the Egyptians built pyramids. When the Greeks were doing like literally nothing. So there is also this jealousy between the two. And that sort of interplay between those two cultures I find really fascinating. And the way that the sort of influence of what women were doing and what kind of power and what kind of power can you exert? And that, I mean, going back to the Game of Thrones thing is one of the things that I find really fascinating about Game of Thrones and something that I like to explore in my own work as well is like, what do people who don't have power do to try to get a hold of power? Like, what are the ways that they find to actually like exercise that power?
And I really want to come back to that point as well in a second. But since you mentioned it, it struck me that they sometimes offhand kind of casual references to the supernatural as a part of everyday life in that world. To me, that really fit in with the conception of the supernatural in the ancient world, certainly in ancient Egypt, and perhaps slightly less so in Greece. But Greece had been known to admire the rituals of Egypt and emulate them in some way, and had mystery cults that were said to be an interpretation of some Egyptian rites. But I found it really interesting that you just throw something in there, like Asinewe's in the library, and she sees ghosts around her and ignores them, and nothing is spent on that. It's just like this throwaway moment. You're just like, yeah, whatever. They might, but she thinks in the supernatural, and she has these dreams, and sometimes they come true.
No, that is, I mean, I think that is one of the things that I love. I mean, one of my favorite things about writing about the ancient world is we have a very strong sense of like what is real and what is not real and what you pay attention to and you don't pay attention to. Dreams aren't prophetic. They're just these things your brain does at night. Like you don't pay too much attention to them. No one really wants to hear about your dreams. They're kind of boring. But talking about these histories again, like they will be really dry and then they'll have like a very detailed, like, and then Caesar dreamt that X, Y, and Z happened because these were things that were equally important, like your dream and then the like white eagle flew over the battlefield and you knew it was the blessing of Zeus or whatever. I mean, and this sort of idea that part of your understanding of the world is an acceptance of the supernatural. Not that it was completely accepted. Obviously the Greeks also had lots of like philosophy about like, are the gods really real? Like, what does that actually mean? And there was lots of thinking about that and analyzing that. But people just did not I mean, of course, I'm sure in 100 years or 1,000 years, someone could say exactly the same thing about us, but people just didn't understand the world the way we do now. I mean, understand the world the way we do now. They didn't have this. We have a very science-focused explanation of the world. I mean, certainly, like, I'm a very secular person. I live in a secular part of my, despite the fact that the U.S. is on the more religious end of industrialized nations. I've always lived in very secular parts of the country and have a very sort of rational explanation for everything. Even though there are things that happen in your life, and if you think about it, that you're like, I don't really have a rational explanation for absolutely everything that happens, but you don't really dwell on the other things because you're like, oh, there must be some explanation out there, right? But in the ancient world, the idea that you would see a shade or a ghost or whatever, like, I mean, we've all thought we've seen things that are not there at some point. Or maybe I sound like a paranoid schizophrenic. I'm like, yeah, you see things that aren't there all the time. But no, like, sometimes you think you see something, right? Mm-hmm. A very distinct moment, like memory from my childhood, when after the father, sort of a family friend, the father of friends of my sister passed away. And I was, I was sleeping and there was a balloon in my room and the balloon started to deflate and I woke up and the balloon was like deflating and like coming towards me. And I was convinced that it was a ghost, like very, very sure it was the ghost of this man who died. And of course I don't think that now. But why not? Why don't I think that now? I don't think that now because everything in my life is saying, oh, that's not a real thing. If all the things that I were reading or many of the things were saying, no, sometimes there are ghosts and sometimes sometimes the gods will get involved and often the gods will be sending you messages. And if you're looking for these messages, they might be there. Mm-hmm. I would have a very different interpretation of, what happens in different moments of your life. So I think that's one of the fun things about writing about the ancient world. Absolutely. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you hit on an important point because a lot of my research deals with people who do have a more spiritual framework for existence and their lives operate with the acceptance of that being a real thing. And the only difference really that I found in the approaches to, say, Egyptological material between those two groups was literally just the acceptance of that one thing. And it didn't mean that one group's interpretation was superior to the other or inferior to the other. It was just a different framework of being. And I guess that's what we're talking about here. It's a different framework for understanding, perhaps not less advanced in many ways, certainly not as advanced scientifically as we understand the world, but with respect to cognitive function, it didn't mean that there was anything untoward going on there. It was just a different understanding of the universe and how it operated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I certainly think that I could imagine somebody saying the same thing about the way that we explain the world right now. And we're so sure that we're right about the way that we see everything. And I am on some level as like a rationalist. And, I'm like, oh yeah, but we are. I mean, sure, they had some ideas and it makes sense, but we're right. But really anything that we believe, anything that I believe about science, I am on some level taking on faith because I can't prove. Science is this great thing that's been built over generations and generations and generations. I can't prove any of the sort of things that I believe to be true about physics and the universe. I can't personally prove them. I'm on some level taking on faith that this is something that has been built up and that is worth believing in. Mm-hmm. So it's not so much crazier to believe in something that's not that. The idea that we each, as sort of rational beings, really are not relying on belief and not taking things on faith is a little bit silly. We're taking lots of things on faith. We're taking different things on faith, but... Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a really interesting article, not to go too far into the weeds, but, we can for this point. There's a really interesting article by a guy called Michael Saylor, who he posits that modernity itself is a form of enchantment. And he deconstructs using, of all things, the idea of Sherlock Holmes, the ultimate rationalist, and how his world is actually a form of enchantment. It's a really fascinating, it's two articles. They're both really interesting in the way that they look at the way that we do absolutely take the scientific world on faith. And in fact, it points the way towards there being kind of science as a belief system as much as anything that's preceded it, despite the fact that it is, of course, I'm not taking anything away from science as, a wonderful methodology for health and engineering and exploring the world, of course, absolutely. But it is worth bearing these things in mind and always remembering our perspective on things and how that lens can colour and affect how we interpret the world and its history, particularly. And coming back onto the point from that little segue there, kind of one of my last points about, or questions about, sources in the ancient world was I wanted to address the rich level of detail in the small things in the lives of these characters. Cleopatra and Caesar, they're often treated with this kind of epic Hollywood scale. And this book manages to feel quite intimate despite occurring on that same scale. And a lot of that comes from, at least to me, the detail that I see. And historical treatments don't usually, they're just listings of significant names and dates and betrayals and upheavals and this stuff. But we've got kind of the minutiae of Arsinoe's surroundings, her clothes, her favorite objects. How did you approach gathering these disparate sources for everyday life and just pulling this stuff together?
Well, I luckily when I was writing this book, I was living in New York, and I had access to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Brooklyn Museum, which are two amazing collections. And I spent a lot of time looking there and going to museums and looking at various objects, because I do think it's important to have those sort of very physical. And that actually, in most ways, that was the hardest part for me, is just finding out how I could really envision this world. And I kind of constructed the palace, which we don't really have an actual floor plan for, looking at some similar, we know what, it's not Diocletian's palace. We know what certain Hellenistic homes looked like and what certain palaces looked like, and kind of building those and kind of creating in my mind. I drew this horrible, on a piece of computer paper sketch. I'm not a great drawer of what the palace looks like and where things are located and all that kind of stuff, and just trying to bring a bunch of different finding information in all these different places of what this might have looked like. Because of course the challenge with the Ptolemies, and there are a lot of challenges with the Ptolemies, but a lot of it's still, Alexandria, there's a modern city of Alexandria, but the Ptolemaic city of Alexandria does not exist. Very, very little is left of that, basically. They essentially, a little bit of the Temple of Serapis, but there's really underground, but it's really nothing. It's all been flooded, and much of it has probably been sort of reused, as everything in the ancient world gets reused. And someone's like, that's some great stone over there. We should use that better. And underwater, and some of it's being excavated, but of course the current political situation in Egypt over the last few years has not really lent itself to working on the underwater excavations. So there isn't that much about a lot of it. So a lot of going through a lot of these art books in various New York public libraries, going through a lot of museum stuff and looking at things and trying to build a sense of what this world would have actually looked like and felt like, which you can't get from, and, reading a couple, I guess, who is it? Diodorus was in Alexandria in 63 BC. So that's, I guess, the closest description of Alexandria, the closest to when I was writing about it, which in the first book starts in 58 BC. And sort of reading those descriptions and trying to fit together a sense of it. And it was a glorious city as well. It would have been absolutely stunning. The Romans were certainly very impressed with it. It's what inspired Augustus to, remake Rome in marble, was because Rome was this muddy brick place, and Alexandria was gorgeous with these huge boulevards and beautiful palaces, and looked the part of this an amazing cosmopolitan city. But yeah, and there are even just a few small objects, because again, there's not that much that's really, especially late Ptolemaic objects. There's not a ton of stuff. So I feel I've looked at a lot of the things and also just sort of tried to reconstruct from other better preserved Hellenistic cities what this might have looked like. but it's very challenging. And even just thinking about like what materials were available, like what would things have been made of, like what, I don't know, that is I think the sort of the deepest and most challenging rabbit hole to go down, because it's not like the actual, I mean, well, probably specifically for this time in history, because what's actually known historically is relatively finite in terms of like what happened when. But trying to really get the best sense and feel of the world was definitely a challenge. And I'm glad that you felt like that came across, because that was something I really tried to evoke through a lot of research. I also traveled around Turkey while I was writing this book, which was very helpful, because Ephesus obviously is a wonderfully preserved Hellenistic city, and they also have some great museums there that preserve other era-specific, if not, because if you go into a lot of Egypt stuff, as I'm sure you know, nobody loves the Ptolemies. I mean, the Egyptologists don't love the Ptolemies. The people who do ancient Greece don't love the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies are like sort of the bastard stepchildren of the ancient world, because they're neither Greek nor Egyptian. You need to like know Demotic, which nobody wants to know to really get deep into the weeds, and you need to obviously know Greek and probably knowing Latin to like actually even start scratching the surface. And they're not like the classical ones, you know, they're not real pharaohs, and they're not real, you know, Athenians, and they're not real anything.
Did you get around to studying some of those languages to try and penetrate the text, or were you relying on translations? Or?
I mostly I have a little bit of Greek. I have ancient Greek. I took some ancient Greek in high school, and I took Latin for many years, so I can penetrate those. The Egyptian, I cannot, but I relied highly on translations, but I'm lucky enough that there's a lot of sort of facing page or the equivalent of facing page stuff on the internet for many of these ancient sources, like, Penelope's, like, Penelope, uchicago.edu. There are many, many, many sources academic sources where you can actually line up the Greek and the English. And fortunately for me, I'm not great in ancient Greek, but I'm good enough to be able to read the words, parse individual words, and compare if there's something that I would come across when I was reading a translation, and I was like, oh, this specific word is like evoking a bunch of stuff for me in terms of what I want to write. Like, I would try to check it against the original Greek so that I could see if it was like, how much of this is translation and how much of this is like what's coming from the actual individual word or phrasing, if that makes sense. So that is fortunate enough for me. And I can sort of look at some cartouches and stuff in hieroglyphics, but I cannot penetrate, make no claims about being able to,
no one can blame you there. There are many Egyptologists, I know myself included, who have tried and failed to penetrate some of the deeper Egyptian texts, and it is an extraordinarily challenging language. But, you know, as an aside, I do love the way that the archaeology and the history and the languages all feed into creating this really rich tapestry. And that was one of the things that struck me about the book as I was reading it, because I was reading historical sources on the same period at the same time. And unlike most Egyptologists, I actually really love that period, because I was captured by the story of Alexander in my teens and followed that through and watched a bunch of Hollywood epics, and then kind of started reading books about the subject. So I do understand the fascination for that period, because it's really unique. We don't have anything quite like it before or since. And I was going to move on to questions about the second book, but I think, given the time, I think it's probably better to save that for a potential second interview, if you're willing, at some point.
I'd love to talk more about the Drowning King.
Excellent. And one thing I did want to finish up with, though, is something that we've pointed to a few times during this interview. Your book's been described as Game of Thrones in ancient Egypt. What do you make of that, for starters?
I mean, I love Game of Thrones. So I'm never. I will take it. I love George R. R. Martin, but it is, I mean, I think that there's a lot of political intrigue. There's, sibling incest. So yay, everyone loves that. Although it's not the same focus, I would say I will warn people, or or I guess maybe some people will be disappointed to find it's not really the same level of focus on that as we get in some of the Game of Thrones books. I mean, I think that there's always a feel and a tendency to compare. I mean, certainly in literature, to compare one thing to another thing. And Game of Thrones is very, very popular right now. And I enjoy the way that Game of Thrones explores this. I enjoy the world building of Game of Thrones. I think it does a very cool job of infusing the world with this sense of religiosity, of like invented religiosity, but again, still based and drawn on, obviously George R. R. Martin has done a lot of research. I mean, sort of on the War of the Roses stuff is the more obvious thing, but a lot of these religions that he's created are based in or rooted in actual like various pagan religious beliefs. You can see a lot of where that comes from. So, I mean, I can see, I mean, I think that anything that is super like political and like fighting siblings and fighting families is going to probably get some sort of comparison to Game of Thrones. And I think it's very different in lots of ways, and probably a little bit sort of, especially the first book, probably slower and more reflective in moments and a little bit more intimate than Game of Thrones, because it's not as, well, the second book is more action packed, but I mean, I will take it. I like those books, and I think that there's a lot more there's lots of overlap between fantasy and historical fiction in many ways, and in all sorts of world. I mean, I'm right now, I'm actually taking a small break from the Ptolemies, and I'm working on this dystopian novel, which is sort of very different in lots of ways, but also very similar in terms of creating, like, doing research, thinking about the way the world is, the way people are, and the way that like politics works and people work, and building up this world that has different rules than the world in which we live. So I think there's much more overlap than difference in all these things.
And I was going to say, actually, the moment you mentioned dystopian, one tends to think of future, one tends to think of, Neuromancer, one tends to think of Blade Runner, etc., Isaac Asimov. But that it could just equally apply to the present day. So is it set in the future or the present, or?
Well, it's set, I mean, it's intended to be set in the future, but the present is doing a very good job of catching up with this dystopian future that I've imagined. So if it doesn't come soon, it might become our present. It's set in a not so distant future America that is, I guess, no longer really America, but yeah. So It's very rooted in the dystopia of today, just envisioned a few, maybe 40, 50 years down the line.
I would be really, really interested to see where you go with that. And my final question, I guess, casting back to the last point is, did you ever picture any particular actors or people when you were writing the book? And have you ever kind of fantasy football done a casting of the movie?
Well, that's a great question. I have like the worst answer because this is one of the things that I am worst at is like remembering who actors and actresses are. And I'm like pretty terrible with faces in general in my actual life. I love, I don't know. I really have, I've thought about it, but again, I think the trickiest part is because Arsinoe is so young at the beginning, it would be a question of like who would be young. Like anyone that I would imagine would not be young. Even like the child actors right now who I'd think of, who are what Maisie Williams, who plays Arya, is already like she's way too old to be playing Arsinoe. Also probably doesn't really look quite right to be Arsinoe anyway. And then you sort of get into all of this sort of like, what did the Ptolemies really look like, which gets into a whole like political bag of like, what did the like Macedonian and like primarily Macedonian, but, what was the, like, who was the actual mother of these children, and like how many of the, like, of these sibling marriages actually full sibling marriages actually yielded offspring, and how many of them were actually like the offspring of some like other liaison who were passed off, and like if they were all actually the offspring, like why didn't they have more birth defects, because that's a lot of like full sibling marriages for 12 generations that you've got going on there. I am terrible at this, and I will someday have a good answer to that question, but today is not that day, so I apologize for that, Paul.
No problem at all. I think I built pictures of various people in my head as I was reading, as I always do. I tend to try and kind of build the world visually in my brain as I'm reading, and it helps me to connect with it a great deal. And thankfully, there was a lot of material there for me to do that with, and a lot of actors floating around in my head with which to do it. So that was a real pleasure.
Some of your fantasy actors, because then maybe I can steal them for next time somebody asks me who I should have play the parts. What do you have anybody on the top of your mind?
Off the top of my head, there were a couple of obvious ones. Berenice's eunuch was the eunuch, an obvious choice, the eunuch from Game of Thrones. And Berenice herself really reminds me of an actor friend of mine called Esme Bianco. She was actually in Game of Thrones as Ros, the red-headed whore, funnily enough. But if you get to know Esme, you'd find that she actually has this very kind of regal aspect about her, and just the way the language phrasing and the behavioural tics kind of manifested really reminded me of her for some reason. So at some point I'm going to have to tell her about that. I'm sure she'll find that a real trip. But a lot of the other characters were quite interchangeable, I must admit. I never settled on a child actor for Arsinoe. I think the random suitors that you get coming to Berenice throughout the book, a lot of them became the kind of the more muscular chaps from Game of Thrones who you see trying to suit the Mother of Dragons, along the way. Those were quite obvious parallels to draw for me. But I myself, I don't have a really comprehensive list because the characters would change faces as I got to know them better and be better personified by different actors. So that's something we'll have to, next time we'll do our Fantasy Football League casting.
Yes, exactly. I'll prepare better for next. I'll have a bunch. I'll have it already.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. It's been so much fun, Paul.
Thanks very much.
That's sadly all we have time for today, but be sure to check back in for new episodes which continue to explore manifestations of the ancient world in the modern, including interviews with a bevy of archaeologists and Egyptologists, hermetics and reconstructionists, and key players in historical entertainment, including authors, filmmakers, actors, and game designers. If you like the show, please subscribe and rate it on your preferred platform and tell all your friends. I've been Dr. Harrison, and this was the Profane Egyptologist podcast. Thanks for listening.